and welcome to a new year of public forum debate and thus a new year of Champion Briefs topic analyses. Today we're going to be looking at the September-October resolution resolved. NATO should substantially increase its defense commitments to the Baltic states. In this video, we're going to do some sort of basic background information, and then we're going to move on to having some recommendations for arguments on both the pro and the con. With that said, there's only so much that I can cover in the span of a short video like this. So if you'd like some more in-depth analysis and some arguments that are fully written out with carded evidence, I would really recommend checking out the Champion Briefs itself, the written brief. With that said, let's jump into the background part of this topic analysis. So first I want to start off by talking about what NATO is. So definitionally, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which comprises of 28 European states and 2 North American states. It was created in the wake of World War II and just in the beginning of the Cold War. After World War II, much of Western Europe was decimated by the conflict, and that left the United States and the Soviet Union to battle it out as the two great superpowers of the world economically and militarily. The West formed NATO in order to basically combat and posture against the threat of a Soviet invasion and Soviet problems coming from the Soviet Union. What does NATO do? They do a whole bunch of things. There is a council of NATO members who are sent by each of the countries, and in order to come to a decision for what they will do, it's necessary that they have complete consensus among the NATO Council. It's not done by a voting process, so all decisions are made unanimously through consensus, and basically the chief of NATO, or whoever the chief officer of NATO is, his job is to mainly facilitate that discussion so they can come to a decision about what to do. There are a wide array of things that NATO can do and ways that they can intervene in emerging situations across the world. They do everything from negotiations and the settlement of treaties in conflicts to establishment of international norms and goals for NATO members in general going forward. Perhaps most notably, one part of NATO in particular, Article 5 of the NATO Charter, states that an attack on one is an attack on all. And that's really important because it means that it functionally creates a defense pact where every NATO state is standing up for every other NATO state. So if the Soviet Union were to mess with any of the smaller countries along their border, they have the full force of the United States military backing them up, since the US is a key member of NATO, as well as many other very powerful militaries in Western Europe. So what it does is it provides protection to much smaller states that might be particularly vulnerable right next to Russia. So that's really the idea behind Article 5. It creates a really robust deterrent to a Russian invasion. The next part of the topic has to do with the Baltic states, right? So now that we've discussed what NATO is, now we can see who exactly are we discussing giving additional military support to. The Baltic states are Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. These 3 states are on the Baltic Sea. They all border Russia, and so are particularly thought of as threats, or are particularly thought of as threatened from a possible Russian invasion. Why would Russia want to invade the Baltics? Well, I think there are 3 main reasons why this might be in their interest. But that being said, do keep in mind that it's not guaranteed that Russia wants to invade the Baltics. In fact, that's going to be a huge part of the debate on both sides, disagreement as to what Russia's incentives are. That being said, why would Russia care? First, because Russia has a grand vision of history, many argue, which means that they would like to recreate the grandness of their past and reconquer areas that used to be part of the Soviet Union, and all of the Baltic states were all former members of the Soviet Union. So perhaps Russia has an incentive to sort of recreate its glory days by taking over these states. Second of all, there are strategic reasons for trade to have the coastline along the Baltics. It makes it much easier to trade with Western Europe as well as with other states in the Baltics as well, along the Baltic Sea as well, such as the Nordic countries. So that's particularly important. And lastly, invading the Baltics might be in Russia's interest in order to posture against NATO. Remember that because the Baltic states are so close to Russia and because they are members of NATO, they are key locations for NATO to be able to deter Russia and to be able to launch attacks if necessary against Russia. So it's a really important spot for NATO's ability to posture against Russia. So if Russia were to be able to take over that land, that would significantly decrease the power that NATO has over Russia. So that's also another big reason why Russia might be interested in invading the Baltics. So again, what is the crux of the topic here? What are we talking about? Most arguments on this topic are going to be revolving around this idea. Whether or not it's worth it, whether or not it is beneficial or harmful from the perspective of the Baltics to give them more aid. Will it make Russia angrier? Will it make Russia more scared? Will it make them more or less likely to invade? That's going to be a huge part of this topic. So with that being said, let's jump into the perspective arguments on both sides. So first, let's talk about the pros. So I'm going to present two arguments on this side. The first, as I mentioned, is this idea of Russian deterrence and / defense, right? So for this argument, you would have to prove that a Russian attack on the Baltic states is imminent and is coming soon. And you could use any of the three warrants that I provided earlier, namely that Russia wants to recreate the Soviet Union, they want the ports on the Baltic Sea for trade, and they want to posture against NATO. You could, of course, find other warrants as well for why they would be interested in taking over the Baltics. And then once you've established that there is a significant probability that Russia, in the status quo, is intending to invade the Baltics, then from there you can state that providing defense commitments to the Baltic states does two things. One, it deters Russia from invading to begin with, right? So Russia before maybe thought they would be easy targets because they're relatively weak states, which means that they probably, in the grand scheme of things, would be the least likely to be defended by NATO and perhaps could be relatively easy to conquer given the strength of Russia's military. But if they were to increase the power of their militaries through the supplements of NATO support, that might mean that Russia would think twice before invading. And so this means that we could stop a Russian invasion before it even began. But second of all, even if Russia did invade, there's an argument to be made here that providing defense commitments to the Baltic states could make it less likely that Russia succeeds or make Russia retreat faster or perhaps just increase the possibility that the Baltic states are able to defend themselves and are able to save more civilian lives from a Russian invasion. So that's the sort of two-tiered aspect to this argument. In terms of what the impact for this argument is, you can basically run this argument with varying degrees of sort of probability versus magnitude, right? So there's always inherently a trade-off in debate between these two things. Almost always, the higher the magnitude, the lower the probability. So you have really arguments on both sides of the spectrums, right? On the one side, with insanely high magnitude and low probability, you could potentially make the argument that this could result in World War III, right? If we prevented Russia from invading the Baltics, that's potentially preventing a conflict where the United States would have gotten involved, which would have involved all of the rest of NATO, would have involved Russia, perhaps Russia's allies, other authoritarian states like China might have gotten involved, Iran might have gotten involved. That would have created a whole terrible World War III where perhaps it might have even led to nuclear conflict, right? And there's even a chance that you could bring that into the debate as well, and resulting in an impact that could conceivably be stretched even to extinction, right? So what you're seeing here is an impact that has a gigantic magnitude that is literally talking about the extinction of the human race, a World War III scenario. That's a possibility here with this argument. On the other hand, you can make a much more walked back version of the argument, something that's not nearly so catastrophic, by saying simply that perhaps Russia doesn't even intend to entirely take over all of the Baltics. Maybe they just want to take over the border, or maybe they just want to take over the coastline, right? They don't even necessarily have an interest in taking over the whole state, right? Maybe the Russian invasion would be small. Maybe it wouldn't really cost that many lives. But the argument is mainly, the spirit of the argument is, we want to avoid a sort of conflict with Russia at all costs. Even a small invasion is going to cost thousands of lives, even on a more principled level, denies these nations of their right to autonomy, of their right to sovereignty. And so you can make arguments that have a much smaller brink of impact, but still are genuinely weighable, for sure. Because, I mean, obviously these are terrible things, right, for Russia to invade the Baltics. So that alone, in most debates, is enough probably to win the round. And again, your advantage with that argument over arguments on the neg would be the fact that it has a high probability. The fact that as you decrease the size of the impact, you increase the chance that it actually happens, which means that you can outweigh other outlandish impacts that the con might have as such. The second argument I want to propose on the pro is this idea of a spending trade-off, right? So when NATO gives more military support to the Baltic states, this means that the Baltic states don't have to spend as much money on their own defense. What does this mean? It means that the Baltic states now have more money that they can spend on other things, such as social services, social programs, infrastructure, education, defense, or local defense. Which means that perhaps we could argue that the Baltic states are going to see an increase in GDP, which is something that they could definitely benefit from. Perhaps we'll see a decrease in poverty, a decrease in infant mortality, right? A lot of developmental impacts. And the benefit of running that argument, again, is that you could say that a lot of the problems of a Russian invasion are, yes, it could cause a lot of death, but these are deaths that happen all at once, and then once the conflict is over, the deaths are over, right? But with this impact, by increasing the amount of economic growth and by decreasing poverty within the Baltic states, that's people's lives that are being saved year over year for decades down the line, right? So although it seems smaller right now, in the long term, this is a far greater impact than an instantaneous Russian invasion, right? So there's definitely room for making this argument and for weighing it quite successfully in a round. So now let's move on to the con. So I'm going to, again, put forth two arguments on the con. The first argument is this idea of Russian retaliation. So this argument is basically the inverse of the pro argument about deterrence and defense. For this argument, you're going to have to prove that Russia basically has no incentive to intervene in the Baltic states at this moment. And when we provide defense commitments to the Baltic states, that shifts Russia's decision-making calculus and actually incentivizes them to invade. Why wouldn't Russia want to invade? Well, I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons, right? One, it's costly. It costs a lot of money to muster that kind of an invasion. Two, it's extremely risky. They're probably going to at least lose a bunch of their soldiers' lives, even if the West doesn't get involved. And then there's also the risk of Article 5 being invoked, which would literally bring the entirety of NATO into this conflict. So there are a bunch of reasons why Russia wouldn't want to take that level of a risk, and why the payoff just really isn't that great. I mean, Russia already has a lot of control over the Baltic states politically. They already have ports along the Baltic Sea, like in St. Petersburg. There are few reasons why they would really stand to gain materially from an invasion of the Baltic states. So I think there's a really good argument to be made here for why there's really very little, if any, incentive for Russia to invade. On the other hand, if we were to commit defense commitments to the Baltic states, then perhaps that would make Russia scared that the West was planning an attack against them. Perhaps it indicates that NATO has plans to invade Russia at some point, or to posture against Russia simply by putting more weapons right along the border. That's really bad. That could make Russia particularly scared of what NATO could come to do going into the future. So, given that might mean that Russia would want to respond in kind with their own kind of retaliation and their own kind of measures, right? as before, you could run the same sort of impact about a a small scale Russian invasion versus a World War III scenario. But there are also more creative versions of this retaliation argument that could be equally successful. For example, you could argue that there's going to be that Russia is going to exercise its economic leverage over the Baltic states. The Baltic states get 90% of their oil through Russia. If Russia were to cut off their oil, then they would basically have to listen to whatever Russia's demands were, right? So that's one sort of trap card that Russia has over the Baltic states that they could potentially use should they be threatened and should they want the West to leave, right? Another thing that they could do is a sort of cyber attack, right? We've already seen in the past that Russia has engaged in mass level cyber attacks. And this is another version of an impact that could be low probability but extremely high magnitude. And as far as impacts with low probability and high magnitude goes, this one actually has a pretty high probability because it has precedent on its side. It's already been done before. So, what are the possible impacts here? Well, with a Russian cyber attack, they could shut down the power grids. They could shut down which could perhaps hurt people who are in hospitals on ventilators, for example, which could totally wreck the economy, make it impossible for them to sell goods, and make it impossible for them to run schools. They could also hack into elections and try to take over the Baltic states politically, right? The impacts here are basically endless, and you can get as creative as you want with a sort of cyber attack impact here. So that's it for this Russian retaliation argument. Again, it's a sort of opposite of the defense and deterrence argument on the pro, because here you're saying that instead of Russia planning to invade right now and we're stopping them, we're saying that Russia is definitely not going to invade right now, but this is going to be the tipping point. This is what's going to make them invade or do X, Y, Z. Now, the second argument on the con. The second argument on the con I want to talk about is an arms race. So this is slightly different from the retaliation argument because this is stating that Russia won't necessarily attack the Baltic states, but that they will significantly increase their own arsenal in response to the Baltic states increasing their arsenal. And the impact here is not necessarily a conflict that's immediate, but perhaps a conflict that happens down the line. And there could be two warrants for a conflict happening down the line because of an arms race, right? One is there's a higher chance of miscalculation. When there's more, and accidents, right? When there's more weapons in general being stockpiled on both sides, there's more of a chance that some activity could be seen as offensive, which could in turn lead to a miscalculation on the other side, then going to attack even though there was really no reason to attack to begin with, right? Additionally, there's also always the chance of an accident, right? There's an accidental launch of some kind of a missile, or it doesn't even have to be nuclear, right? It could be any kind of missile, any kind of bomb. And again, that would again cause a possible skirmish along the borders. The other reason why an arms race might lead to conflict is that both nations are now stronger and more emboldened, right? Because both nations now have stronger militaries, they both perhaps feel like they have a higher chance of winning in a conflict. Again, you'd have to prove that there is at least the baseline incentive to invade, right? Just because they're capable of winning the war doesn't mean that they would want to do it. But you'd have to reason that there would be reason to do it. But again, there's plenty of warrants for why Russia might actually want to invade the Baltics. And providing them with a stronger military could be the tipping point for them actually going ahead and doing so. This, again, mitigates a lot of the impacts on the pro, where the pro talks about deterrence, because the whole deterrence argument is that, oh no, Russia thinks that they're going to lose if they invade. But again, if Russia has a stronger military, then maybe they wouldn't think they would lose if they invaded, even if the Baltics had a stronger military. So there again, we see an inverse of the pro argument. So I'm going to end the topic analysis there. We have two really good arguments for both the pro and the con. I think you can make them both round winning for sure. And if you would like more in-depth analysis, more arguments with cards already ready to go out of the box, I recommend that you check out the actual written champion briefs itself. Thanks so much for watching this video. Good luck to everyone in September and October. Happy debating.